Welcome, dear listeners, to another elegant mystery where refinement masks resentment and silence hides a deadly truth. Tonight's case unfolds inside Hawthorne Manor, a grand country estate where velvet curtains soften secrets, polished floors conceal footsteps, and a single poisoned drink shatters an evening of privilege. When a respected guest collapses inside the manor's drawing room, suspicion settles among its occupants like dust that cannot be brushed away. Hercule Poirot arrives to investigate a crime shaped by etiquette, envy, and a killer who believed manners would shield them from justice. Settle in, relax, and engage your little grey cells. Because in the velvet drawing room of Hawthorne Manor, someone served death with perfect courtesy. Chapter 1. Death among the velvet Hawthorne Manor had been designed for admiration, not urgency. It stood apart from the narrow country road set back behind wrought iron gates and a long avenue of ancient yew trees, whose branches met overhead like a natural archway. Visitors arriving at the house felt the gradual shift immediately, the sense that time moved differently here, sounds softened, movements slowed, voices lowered of their own accord. On the evening Edgar Whitcomb died, the manor was exactly as it had always been, elegant, orderly, and impeccably polite. Inside, the velvet drawing room glowed with a warmth that seemed almost intentional in its reassurance. Deep, wine-colored curtains framed tall windows, their heavy folds absorbing the darkness outside. A grand chandelier scattered soft light across polished tables and gilded frames. Chairs were arranged with careful symmetry, each placed to encourage conversation without intimacy. It was a room designed to contain people. Sir Reginald Hawthorne sat near the fireplace, his posture relaxed, his expression practiced in its hospitality. Lady Hawthorne moved gracefully among the guests, ensuring teacups were never empty and conversation never stalled. Servants glided in and out with near invisibility, trained to observe without intruding. The gathering was modest but deliberate. Edgar Whitcomb sat nearest the window, a porcelain teacup balanced neatly in his hand. He was a man accustomed to comfort, silver hair carefully combed, suit pressed, manners flawless. He had been a close associate of the Hawthorne family for decades, present at countless dinners, anniversaries, and negotiations that never quite made their way beyond the manor's walls. To the casual observer, Edgar Whitcomb appeared entirely at ease, but Hercule Poirot would later note something different. Whitcomb spoke less than usual that evening. When he did, his words were measured, as though weighed carefully before release. His gaze lingered longer than necessary on certain faces, Sir Reginald's in particular, before returning to his teacup. Tea was served at precisely 8:30. The pot was placed on the central table, steaming gently. Cups were arranged beforehand, each one matching perfectly. White porcelain edged with gold, the Hawthorne crest discreetly embossed near the handle. Sugar and milk were offered. Conversation continued without interruption. Everything proceeded as it always had, until it didn't. Edgar Whitcomb lifted his teacup, took a single sip, and paused. At first no one noticed. The drawing room was filled with low conversation, the quiet crackle of the fire, the faint rustle of velvet as guests shifted in their seats. Whitcomb's stillness went unnoticed for several seconds, long enough for confusion to register on his face. He frowned slightly, as though trying to identify a taste that did not belong. Then his hand tightened around the cup. His breath caught, not sharply, not dramatically, but with subtle difficulty. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to excuse himself, perhaps to comment on the tea. No sound emerged. The teacup slipped from his fingers and struck the carpet, shattering softly, porcelain fragments scattering against the velvet pile. Whitcomb leaned forward, his body folding inward with unsettling calm, and then collapsed entirely. For a heartbeat, the room remained frozen. Lady Hawthorne screamed. Chairs scraped back violently. Someone knocked over a side table. A servant rushed forward. Another darted toward the door. Sir Reginald stood abruptly, his face drained of color. "Doctor!" someone shouted, but Edgar Whitcomb did not move. When the household physician arrived minutes later, the drawing room had already transformed. The symmetry was broken. The velvet carpet was stained with tea and shattered porcelain. The guests stood along the walls, whispering anxiously, eyes fixed on the still figure on the floor. The doctor knelt, checked for breath, then for pulse. He looked up slowly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "He's gone." Shock settled heavily into the room. Inspector Japp arrived before midnight, summoned from the nearest town. He stood near the doorway, taking in the scene with a practiced eye. No overturned furniture, no sign of struggle, just a body, a broken cup, and a room full of witnesses who all claimed the same thing. "He was fine moments before," Lady Hawthorne said repeatedly. "He took one sip," another guest insisted. "There was no argument," Sir Reginald added stiffly. The doctor returned with his preliminary conclusion. "Poison," he said quietly. "Fast-acting, likely tasteless." Japp exhaled slowly. "In tea?" "Yes," the doctor replied. "But not in the pot." Japp frowned. "How do you know?" "Because no one else is ill," the doctor said, "which means the poison was administered individually." A murmur rippled through the guests. Hercule Poirot arrived shortly thereafter. He entered the velvet drawing-room with the air of a man stepping into a place that had already begun speaking to him. He paused at the threshold, allowing his eyes to travel slowly from the curtains to the chandelier, from the scattered porcelain to the faces of the guests. Poirot did not rush. He crouched near the shattered teacup, careful not to disturb anything, and studied the fragments. "One cup," he murmured. Japp nodded. "Everyone drank tea." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Yes," Poirot said softly, "but only one cup was prepared differently." Poirot straightened and moved toward the tea table. He examined the remaining cups, identical, spotless, untouched since the moment of panic. "The poison," Poirot said calmly, "was not added to the pot. That would be careless." Poirot turned slowly, letting his gaze pass over each person present. "This murder," he continued, "was not impulsive. It was not emotional. It was considerate." Japp raised an eyebrow. "Considerate?" Poirot gestured gently toward the room. "No disturbance, no raised voices, no struggle. The victim was allowed dignity, even in death." Poirot stopped near the window, glancing at the heavy velvet curtains. "The drawing-room," Poirot said, "is designed to soften sound, hide tension, and encourage complacency." Poirot turned back. "The killer relied on this." Japp frowned. "So someone here prepared that cup." "We," Poirot replied, "and knew exactly where Edgar Whitcomb would sit." Poirot walked to Whitcomb's chair and examined its position relative to the table. "Closest to the sideboard," Poirot noted. "Convenient?" Japp crossed his arms. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Poirot said quietly, "that the cup could be handled without notice." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "And Edgar Whitcomb trusted the hands that served him." As servants were dismissed and the guests escorted to separate rooms, Poirot lingered alone in the drawing-room for a moment longer. He listened, the velvet absorbed sound completely now. The house felt heavy, as though holding its breath. "Manners," Poirot murmured, "are a wonderful disguise." He straightened and adjusted his coat. Somewhere in Hawthorne Manor, the killer was already replaying the evening, the placement of the cup, the moment of the sip, the calm collapse. They believed etiquette had protected them. Poirot smiled faintly. It never did. Chapter 2. Guests, Cups, and Quiet Resentments. Hawthorne Manor did not awaken easily after death. Morning arrived with careful restraint, as though the house itself feared disturbing what lingered in its corridors. Curtains were drawn back inch by inch. Fires were lit without enthusiasm. Servants moved softly, avoiding the velvet drawing-room altogether, as if the events of the previous night might still be seated there, waiting. Hercule Poirot rose early. He preferred the hours before conversation resumed, when people had not yet decided what version of events they would present to the world. Truth, Poirot knew, was always most vulnerable before breakfast. Inspector Japp joined him in the small morning room overlooking the gardens. A tray of untouched tea sat between them. "No one slept much," Japp said. "Every guest claims shock. Every one of them insists they saw nothing unusual." Poirot smiled faintly. "Of course, manners are strongest in moments of discomfort." Poirot lifted his cup but did not drink. Instead, he studied it. "Inspector," he said softly, "who prepared the tea?" Japp consulted his notes. "Servants brewed it in the kitchen. The pot was brought in by the footman. Cups were already laid out on the side table." Poirot nodded. "And who arranged the cups?" Japp frowned. "Lady Hawthorne supervises that herself." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Ah," Poirot murmured. "The hostess." Poirot stood and walked toward the velvet drawing-room, pausing at the threshold as though greeting an old adversary. In daylight, the room looked different, but not innocent. The shattered cup had been cleared away, yet Poirot could still see its ghost, the precise spot where Edgar Whitcomb had sat, the faint discoloration on the carpet, the slight disturbance in the velvet pile. Poirot moved slowly toward the sideboard. The tea service had been removed, but its arrangement lingered in memory. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "where was Whitcomb seated?" "Nearest the window," Japp replied. "Closest to the side table." Poirot nodded. "Conveniently." Poirot closed his eyes briefly, reconstructing the scene. The pot placed centrally, cups laid out beforehand, servants present but not watching closely, conversation flowing just loudly enough to discourage attention. Poirot opened his eyes. "This cup," he said softly, indicating Whitcomb's place, "could have been altered without difficulty." Japp crossed his arms. "So we're looking at opportunity." "Oui," Poirot replied, "but also confidence." Poirot turned away from the table. "Let us speak to the guests." Sir Reginald Hawthorne. Sir Reginald received Poirot in the library, a room defined by order and habit. Books were arranged by subject, not size. Papers lay neatly stacked. Nothing appeared out of place. "I've hosted hundreds of gatherings," Sir Reginald said stiffly. "Nothing like this has ever happened." Poirot inclined his head politely. "You were close to Mr. Whitcomb." "Professionally," Sir Reginald replied. "Yes." Poirot tilted his head. "Financially?" Sir Reginald hesitated. "He advised me. Nothing more." Poirot nodded. "Did you prepare his cup?" "Of course not," Sir Reginald snapped. "That is not my role." Poirot smiled faintly. "Roles are interesting things, monsieur." Lady Hawthorne sat upright in her sitting room, hands folded, expression controlled. "I ensured the cups were placed correctly," she said calmly, "as I always do." Poirot nodded. "And you know your guests' preferences?" "Yes?" Poirot leaned slightly forward. "Including Edgar Whitcomb's?" She hesitated. "He preferred no sugar." Poirot smiled gently. "And was that cup prepared accordingly?" "Yes," she said. "I made sure." Poirot thanked her politely, but his little grey cells were already active. Geraldine Hawthorne, niece Geraldine, lounged in a chair by the window, arms crossed. "Uncle Edgar!" she scoffed. "He was unbearable." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "In what way?" "He believed he owned this house," she said bitterly, "advising, correcting, interfering." Poirot nodded. "Did you touch his cup?" She shook her head. "I barely touched the table." Poirot smiled. "Barely is still something." Philip Marrow, family solicitor, Marrow adjusted his spectacles nervously. "Mr. Whitcomb intended to revise certain documents," he admitted, "which would have complicated matters." Poirot tilted his head. "Complicated for whom?" Marrow hesitated. "For the estate." Poirot nodded slowly. Mrs. Eliza Grant, companion. Mrs. Grant's voice trembled as she spoke. "He was worried," she said. "Edgar feared someone wished him harm." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Did he say who?" "No," she replied. "Only that trust was dangerous." Poirot smiled faintly. When Poirot returned to the drawing-room, the picture had begun to form. Everyone had motive. Several had access. But only one thing mattered. "The cup," Poirot murmured. Poirot turned to Japp. "Inspector," he said. "The poison was added after the cup was placed, but before it was lifted." Japp frowned. "That narrows the window." "Exactly," Poirot replied, "which means the killer was calm enough to act during conversation." Poirot paused, then added softly, "and confident enough not to fear observation." Poirot walked to the window and drew the velvet curtain aside slightly. "Inspector," he said, "this murder required someone who belonged here." Japp nodded. "Family, or trusted inner circle." Poirot's eyes hardened. "And someone who knew that in this room," Poirot said. "Politeness is the perfect cover." The killer had not rushed, had not panicked, had not been sloppy. They had simply reached and altered one small thing. As Poirot left the drawing room, he was certain of one fact. This murder would not be solved by fingerprints or chemistry alone. It would be solved by understanding who felt entitled enough to poison a cup in full view and expect no one to notice. Chapter 3. The servant who saw too much Hawthorne Manor had returned to its routines with unsettling speed. Breakfast was served at the usual hour, fires were lit in the usual rooms, servants resumed their quiet, circuits through corridors and staircases polished by generations of obedience. To an outsider, the house appeared unchanged, but Poirot knew better. Great houses, like great crimes, depended on habit, and habit, when disrupted, revealed its weakest points. Hercule Poirot stood near the servants' corridor shortly after breakfast, pretending to admire a framed hunting print while observing everything reflected faintly in the glass. Inspector Japp joined him, lowering his voice. "You're watching them," Japp murmured. "Yes," Poirot replied softly, "because servants see what guests believe goes unnoticed." The servants' corridor was narrow and practical, stripped of the manor's velvet elegance. Footsteps echoed here. Conversations did not linger, yet it was this corridor that connected kitchen to drawing room, pantry to sideboard, privacy to performance. Poirot turned as a young footman approached. Thomas Wilkes was barely 20, his uniform crisp but his posture tense. His eyes flicked toward Poirot, then away, then back again. "You were on duty last night," Poirot said gently. "Yes, sir." "You carried the tea tray." "Yes, monsieur." Poirot smiled faintly. "Good, then let us talk." They sat in a small service room, the door left open deliberately. Poirot disliked closed spaces when truth was nervous. Thomas clasped his hands together. "I didn't do anything wrong," he blurted. Poirot raised a hand. "I have not accused you." Thomas swallowed. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Tell me exactly how the tea was prepared." Thomas hesitated, then spoke quickly as though rehearsed. "The tea was brewed in the kitchen. Mrs. Henshaw supervised. Cups were laid out earlier in the drawing room. I carried the pot in. Lady Hawthorne poured." Poirot nodded. "And the cups?" "They were already there." Poirot tilted his head. "All of them?" "Yes." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Did you notice anything unusual?" Thomas hesitated. Poirot waited. "Someone moved," Thomas said finally. "Who?" Japp asked sharply. Thomas swallowed. "Miss Geraldine Hawthorne." Poirot's moustache twitched. "She stood near the side table," Thomas continued. "Just for a moment. She laughed. Everyone was talking." Poirot nodded slowly. "And did you see her touch a cup?" "No," Thomas said quickly. "But she was close." Japp frowned. "That's not much." Poirot raised a finger. "It is enough to be dangerous." Later that morning, the rumor had already begun circulating through the household. The footman saw something. The niece was near the cup. She hated Whitcomb. Geraldine Hawthorne was summoned. She entered the drawing room with defiance, barely concealed behind a polished smile. "So now I'm the villain," she said coolly. "How convenient." Poirot inclined his head. "Mademoiselle, convenience is rarely truth." Geraldine folded her arms. "Yes, I stood near the table. Everyone did." Poirot nodded. "But you are the only one who did so without purpose." She scoffed. "I was bored." Poirot smiled faintly. "Boredom leads people to dangerous places." Poirot leaned closer. "Did you dislike Edgar Whitcomb?" She laughed sharply. "Dislike? He was insufferable." Poirot nodded. "But murder?" She met his gaze. "No." Poirot believed her, not because she was innocent, but because she was careless. This murder was not careless. Later, Poirot and Japp reviewed the servant statements again. "The footman saw movement," Japp said. "The niece had motive. That's enough for a charge." Poirot shook his head. "Nah, it is enough for distraction." Poirot rose and walked toward the kitchen. If poison entered the drawing room, it began somewhere else. The kitchen was large, bright, and ruled by Mrs. Henshaw, the cook. She stood firm as Poirot questioned her. "No poison passed through my kitchen," she said firmly. "I'd know." Poirot nodded. "I do not doubt it." Poirot examined the tea caddy. "Who has access to this?" Poirot asked. "Me, the footman. Lady Hawthorne occasionally." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "Occasionally," he repeated. Poirot asked for the poison report. The doctor returned with preliminary findings. Plant-based toxin, he said. Colorless, tasteless, dissolves quickly in hot liquid. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Something that belongs in a greenhouse, Poirot murmured. Hawthorne Manor had one. The conservatory stood at the eastern wing, filled with exotic plants collected over decades. Poirot walked slowly through it, breathing in the heavy scent of damp earth and unfamiliar blossoms. A gardener straightened as Poirot approached. "Any poisonous plants here?" Poirot asked calmly. The gardener hesitated. "A few rare specimens, locked cabinet." Poirot smiled faintly. "Who holds the key?" The gardener glanced away. "Lady Hawthorne." The false suspect was beginning to crumble, but Poirot was not finished. He returned to the servants' corridor that evening and watched again. Servants passed, guests lingered, conversations overlapped. Poirot noticed something subtle. Thomas Wilkes, the footman, avoided the conservatory door entirely. Poirot called him aside again. "You are afraid," Poirot said gently. Thomas's eyes filled. "I didn't poison anyone," Poirot nodded. "But you carried something." Thomas broke. "Lady Hawthorne asked me to bring her a cup earlier, before the others arrived." Japp stiffened. Poirot remained calm. "Earlier?" "Yes," Thomas whispered. "She said she wanted to check the placement." Poirot closed his eyes. The footman had not seen too much. He had seen too early. Poirot straightened. "Inspector," he said quietly, "Geraldine Hawthorne was meant to be seen." Japp frowned. "And the footman," Poirot replied softly, "was meant to remember." Poirot turned back toward the velvet drawing-room. The poison had not been added during tea. It had been added before tea, and only one person had the authority to prepare a single cup in advance without raising suspicion. The false suspect had served their purpose. Now the real game could begin. Chapter 4. The privilege of the hostess Hawthorne Manor had always been governed by invisible rules. Who sat where, who spoke first, who poured the tea. These were not matters of chance. They were privileges, subtle, unquestioned, and deeply powerful. And as Hercule Poirot stood once more in the velvet drawing-room, he understood that Edgar Whitcomb had not been poisoned because he was careless. He had been poisoned because he was expected. Poirot positioned himself near the side table, exactly where the teacups had rested that evening. The servants had cleared everything away, yet the geometry of the room still whispered its truth. He closed his eyes briefly, reconstructing the moment. Lady Hawthorne standing calmly, guests arriving gradually, one cup already placed, waiting. Inspector Japp entered quietly. "You're thinking about timing," Japp said. Poirot nodded. "We? And about permission." Poirot turned to face him. "Inspector," Poirot said softly, "in houses like this, servants do not question. Guests do not interfere. Only the hostess may rearrange without explanation." Japp frowned. "So Lady Hawthorne could prepare a cup in advance." "Not only could," Poirot replied, "but could do so invisibly." They requested Lady Hawthorne's presence. She arrived composed, dressed in muted colors, her expression calm enough to appear innocent or rehearsed. "Monsieur Poirot," she said politely, "you wish to speak with me again?" Poirot inclined his head. "Madame, you understand the importance of ceremony," she smiled faintly. "I do." Poirot gestured gently toward the side table. "You personally ensured the cups were placed correctly." "Yes," she replied. "As hostess, that is my responsibility." Poirot nodded. "And you know Edgar Whitcomb's preferences." "Yes," Poirot leaned slightly forward, "including the fact that he never took sugar." Her eyes flickered, just briefly. Poirot continued calmly. "And that he preferred to sit near the window," she nodded. "It was his habit." Poirot smiled faintly. "Habits are reliable things." Poirot walked slowly toward the window, then turned back. "Madame," Poirot said gently, "at what time did you enter the drawing-room before the guests arrived?" She hesitated. "I don't recall precisely." Poirot nodded. "Earlier than the others." She did not deny it. Poirot continued. "You asked the footman to bring you a cup earlier in the evening?" She drew a slow breath. "Yes. I wished to check the placement." Poirot inclined his head. "Placement or preparation?" Her expression tightened slightly. Poirot's tone remained polite. The poison was tasteless. It required careful dissolution. That takes time. She folded her hands. Are you accusing me? Poirot shook his head. No, madame, I am observing. Poirot straightened. You had opportunity, Poirot said. You had access, and you had authority. Silence stretched. Japp shifted his weight. Poirot continued gently. But authority alone does not kill. Lady Hawthorne's eyes sharpened. What do you mean? Poirot replied softly. You did not act alone. Her composure cracked, not fully, but enough. Poirot leaned closer. Someone advised you, he said quietly. Someone who knew poison, someone who knew Edgar Whitcomb would not question a cup placed by you. Lady Hawthorne stood abruptly. This is outrageous. Poirot remained calm. Outrage is loud. Guilt is careful. She turned away, pacing. I was protecting this family, she said sharply. Whitcomb was going to expose matters that would have destroyed us. Poirot nodded slowly. Exposure is not execution. She stopped. He gave us everything, then threatened to take it away. Poirot's eyes softened slightly. And someone convinced you, Poirot said, that one small adjustment would solve everything. Her shoulders slumped. It was meant to be a fright, she whispered. An illness, enough to delay him. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Poison, he said softly, is never a delay. She looked up sharply. I didn't push him. I didn't force him to drink. Poirot nodded. No, you relied on trust. Poirot stepped back. Madame, Poirot said, who told you what to use? Her voice dropped. Someone who knew plants. Japp stiffened. The conservatory, Poirot murmured. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Someone who understands cultivation, Poirot continued. Someone who knows which doses weaken and which kill. Lady Hawthorne shook her head. They said it would not be fatal, Poirot replied quietly. They lied. Poirot walked to the door, then turned. One final question, Poirot said. Who suggested the timing? Lady Hawthorne hesitated. Who told you? Poirot pressed gently. That tea would be safest, most invisible? She closed her eyes. My cousin, she whispered. Alistair Hawthorne. Japp inhaled sharply. The estate manager, Japp said. Poirot nodded slowly. Ah, Poirot murmured. A man who moves freely, who knows routines, who knows plants. Poirot's little grey cells stirred. Lady Hawthorne sank into a chair. He said it would look natural, she said weakly. He said no one would suspect me, Poirot replied softly, because in this house, suspicion avoids the hostess. Poirot turned to Japp. Inspector, he said quietly. Lady Hawthorne prepared the cup. Japp nodded. Accessory to murder. Poirot raised a finger. But not the architect. Poirot glanced toward the corridor leading to the conservatory. The mind behind this, Poirot said, has not yet been confronted. Outside, the afternoon light filtered through the velvet curtains, soft and forgiving. But Poirot knew the true poison was not in the cup. It was in the suggestion, the reassurance, the confidence of a man who knew exactly where to stand while others did the dirty work. And now, that man's shadow had finally taken shape. Chapter 5. The man who knew the house too well. Hawthorne Manor had always obeyed Alistair Hawthorne. Not openly, not loudly, but with the quiet efficiency that comes only when authority is exercised without resistance. As estate manager, Alistair moved through the house and grounds with ease. Doors opened for him, schedules adjusted at his suggestion, and servants deferred instinctively. It was this invisibility of influence that troubled Hercule Poirot most. The morning after Lady Hawthorne's quiet collapse into confession, Poirot requested that Alistair Hawthorne join him for a walk through the conservatory. It was a polite invitation. It did not sound like an interrogation. Alistair accepted immediately. He arrived precisely on time, tall, neatly dressed, his manner relaxed in the way of men who believed themselves beyond suspicion. He smiled easily as he joined Poirot beneath the glass roof of the conservatory, where sunlight filtered through leaves and petals of rare and carefully cultivated plants. A beautiful place, Poirot remarked. Yes, Alistair replied. My pride and joy. Poirot nodded. One can tell everything here is maintained with precision Alistair smiled faintly. "That's my job." Poirot walked slowly, his eyes moving from plant to plant, lingering just long enough to suggest appreciation rather than scrutiny. "Some of these are quite rare," Poirot said. "Dangerous too, if mishandled?" Alistair shrugged lightly. "Knowledge removes danger." Poirot stopped. "Does it?" he asked gently. Alistair met his gaze without hesitation. "It does, when applied correctly." Poirot smiled faintly and resumed walking. "Lady Hawthorne tells me," Poirot said conversationally, "that you suggested tea would be the safest moment." Alistair's stride did not falter. "Tea is predictable," Poirot nodded, "and predictability is useful." They reached a locked cabinet at the far end of the conservatory. Alistair produced a key without hesitation and opened it. Inside were labeled jars, dried leaves, and pressed roots, everything carefully catalogued. Poirot leaned closer. "This one," Poirot said, pointing gently. "Fast-acting, tasteless, dissolves easily in hot liquid." Alistair inclined his head. "A fascinating specimen." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Who besides you has access to this cabinet?" Poirot asked. "Lady Hawthorne," Alistair replied. "Occasionally," Poirot nodded. "Occasionally is enough," Poirot closed the cabinet and turned. "Tell me, monsieur," Poirot said softly, "did Edgar Whitcomb threaten the estate?" Alistair's smile thinned slightly. "He threatened changes." Poirot nodded. "Changes often feel like threats to those who profit from stability." Alistair stopped walking. "You're suggesting I had motive," he said calmly. Poirot inclined his head. "I am suggesting you had opportunity, knowledge, and access." Alistair chuckled quietly. "That describes half the staff." Poirot shook his head gently. "No, only one man understood the house well enough to orchestrate silence." Poirot gestured around them. "You know when servants move," Poirot continued. "You know when guests gather. You know which rules cannot be questioned." Alistair's gaze hardened slightly. "That's management," Poirot smiled. "That is orchestration." Later that afternoon, Poirot asked Inspector Japp to arrange a review of estate records. Not finances, but schedules. They sat together in the study, papers spread before them. "Servant rotations," Japp muttered. "Conservatory access logs, delivery times." Poirot tapped one entry. "Here," Poirot said. "The conservatory was accessed earlier than usual." Japp frowned. "By Alistair," Poirot nodded. "And the footman was sent away," Poirot added softly. Japp looked up. "Deliberately." Poirot leaned back. "This murder was not committed with a single act." Poirot's voice was calm, almost instructional. "It was committed through permission." That evening, Poirot requested a final conversation with Lady Hawthorne, this time in the presence of Alistair. They met in the drawing room once more, the velvet curtains drawn back to allow the fading light inside. Lady Hawthorne sat rigidly, her composure fraying at the edges. Alistair stood near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. Poirot addressed them both. "Madame," Poirot said gently, "you believed you were preventing ruin." She nodded weakly. Poirot turned to Alistair. "And you," Poirot said calmly, "believed you were correcting a mistake." Alistair's eyes narrowed. Whitcomb would have dismantled everything. Poirot nodded. "He would have exposed truths." Alistair stepped forward. "Truth is not always kind," Poirot replied softly, "nor is murder." Poirot paced slowly. "You selected the poison," Poirot said. "You advised the timing. You allowed another to carry the guilt." Alistair's voice remained steady. "I never touched the cup." Poirot stopped. "No," Poirot said. "You never needed to." Poirot leaned closer. "You relied on hierarchy, on trust, on the certainty that the hostess would not be questioned." Alistair exhaled slowly. "It worked." Poirot shook his head. "It worked until it didn't." Poirot straightened and turned to Japp. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "we are close but not complete." Japp frowned. "What's missing?" Poirot's gaze remained on Alistair. "Confirmation," Poirot replied. Poirot smiled faintly. "And I know exactly how to obtain it." As night settled over Hawthorne Manor, Poirot returned once more to the conservatory. Alone this time, he examined the cabinet again, noting something new. One jar had been replaced, not refilled, not rearranged, replaced. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. The killer had returned to ensure control, which meant one thing: they were nervous. And nervous men make mistakes. The trap was set. All that remained was to invite everyone back into the velvet drawing room, where politeness once hid murder, and allow the truth to be spoken aloud. Chapter 6. The Confession That Promised Peace. Confessions arrived at Hawthorne Manor the way comfort did, quietly, politely, and far too easily. The morning was grey and subdued, the sort of weather that encouraged people to believe the worst had already passed. Poirot noticed it immediately. A house that had spent days in tension now seemed eager to settle, to tidy away the disturbance Edgar Whitcomb's death had caused. That eagerness worried him. Lady Hawthorne requested to see Inspector Japp shortly after breakfast. Poirot was present, though he said nothing at first. He sat near the window of the small sitting room, hands folded, observing the play of light against the curtains while Lady Hawthorne spoke. "I wish to make a full statement," she said, her voice steady but exhausted. "I prepared the cup. I used the substance from the conservatory. Edgar Whitcomb drank it. He died." Japp looked up sharply. "You're confessing to murder?" Lady Hawthorne swallowed. "To responsibility." Poirot felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Responsibility was not guilt. It was refuge. "I acted to protect my family," Lady Hawthorne continued. "Whitcomb intended to expose matters that would have ruined us." Japp glanced toward Poirot. "She's admitting motive and method." Poirot raised a finger gently. "Madame," Poirot said softly, "may I ask you something before this statement is recorded?" Lady Hawthorne nodded. "You believed this confession would bring peace," Poirot said. "Yes," she replied quickly. "End the speculation." Poirot inclined his head. "Who told you it would?" She hesitated. Poirot leaned slightly forward. "Who assured you that accepting blame would preserve the estate?" Her hands trembled. "Alistair." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. He turned to Japp. "Inspector, this confession is convenient." Japp frowned. "She admitted everything." Poirot nodded. "Everything except initiation." Poirot turned back to Lady Hawthorne. "Madame," he said gently, "when you prepared that cup, did you believe Edgar Whitcomb would die?" Her voice broke. "No." Poirot's tone softened further. "You believed he would fall ill?" "Yes." Poirot nodded slowly. "Then your intention and the outcome are not aligned?" Japp exhaled sharply. Poirot raised a hand. "Inspector," he said calmly, "allow me to continue." Poirot turned again to Lady Hawthorne. "You did not choose the poison," Poirot said. "You did not calculate the dosage. You did not decide the timing." Lady Hawthorne shook her head weakly. "I trusted Alistair." Poirot nodded. "And trust is how this crime moves." A knock sounded at the door. Alistair Hawthorne entered with measured calm, as though he had anticipated the moment. "I hear my cousin is trying to protect us all," he said lightly. Poirot stood. "Monsieur Hawthorne," Poirot said calmly, "your timing is impeccable." Alistair smiled faintly. "I try to be efficient." Poirot gestured toward Lady Hawthorne. "She believes confessing will bring peace," Poirot said. "Do you agree?" Alistair shrugged. "Peace is valuable." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "At any cost?" Poirot asked. Alistair met his gaze. "At the cost of scandal." Poirot nodded. "But not at the cost of truth." Poirot stepped closer. "You advised her," Poirot said quietly. "You reassured her. You promised resolution." Alistair folded his arms. "Someone had to act." Poirot smiled faintly. "Indeed, and you ensured it was not you." The room felt suddenly smaller. Japp cleared his throat. "Alistair Hawthorne, did you instruct Lady Hawthorne to poison Edgar Whitcomb?" Alistair answered smoothly. "I suggested a preventative measure." Poirot shook his head. "Poison is not prevention," Poirot said softly. "It is conclusion." Poirot turned back to Lady Hawthorne. "Madame," he said gently, "this confession will not be accepted." She looked up, startled. "But Poirot interrupted softly. "Because it is incomplete." Poirot turned to Japp. "Inspector," he said, "a public resolution is required." Japp frowned. Public? Poirot nodded. This crime relied on privacy and hierarchy. It must be undone with transparency. Poirot turned back to Alistair. I would like, Poirot said calmly, for everyone present that evening to gather again in the velvet drawing room. Alistair's smile tightened. Is that necessary? Poirot met his gaze. Absolutely. That afternoon, Poirot walked alone through Hawthorne Manor, noting small details that had escaped attention before. The conservatory cabinet locked again, the tea service polished excessively, the servants watching Alistair when he passed. Fear had replaced confidence. Poirot paused in the servants' corridor and spoke quietly to Thomas Wilkes. You were asked to forget, Poirot said gently. Thomas nodded. Yes, Poirot smiled faintly. You do not need to any more. As evening approached, invitations were delivered. Formal, polite, unavoidable, everyone would return to the velvet drawing room, as they had on the night Edgar Whitcomb died, as they would now, to hear the truth spoken aloud. Poirot stood alone in the drawing room as twilight settled, the velvet curtains glowing softly in the fading light. Manners, he murmured, will no longer protect you. Somewhere in the house, Alistair Hawthorne sensed it too. The confession had failed, and the room that once concealed murder was about to expose it. Chapter 7. When politeness became a weapon. The velvet drawing room was prepared exactly as it had been on the night Edgar Whitcomb died. That detail was not accidental. Hercule Poirot had insisted upon it. The chairs were arranged in the same careful symmetry. The side table stood in the same position, polished until it reflected the chandelier's glow. Even the tea service, though unused, had been placed precisely where it once stood, gleaming with silent accusation. As dusk settled outside Hawthorne Manor, the guests arrived one by one. They entered politely, quietly, each person taking their place with the same unconscious choreography they had followed before. Proof, Poirot noted, that habit was stronger than memory. Lady Hawthorne sat closest to the fireplace, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Sir Reginald Hawthorne stood near the mantel, avoiding everyone's eyes. Geraldine Hawthorne lounged stiffly, her earlier defiance replaced by tension. Philip Marrow adjusted his spectacles repeatedly. Mrs. Eliza Grant sat very straight, lips pressed thin. And finally, Alistair Hawthorne positioned himself beside the conservatory door, relaxed, observant, in control. Poirot waited until the door was closed. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began calmly, thank you for agreeing to return here this evening. No one responded. Poirot did not mind. This room, Poirot continued, is designed for comfort, for elegance, for reassurance. He gestured gently around them. That is why it was chosen, Sir Reginald frowned. Chosen for what? Poirot turned toward him. For murder, Poirot said quietly. A ripple of discomfort passed through the group. Poirot walked slowly toward the side table. On the night Edgar Whitcomb died, Poirot said, nothing appeared unusual. Tea was served, conversation continued, manners were observed. Poirot lifted an empty teacup. And yet, he said softly, one cup was different. Poirot turned back to the group. Let us be clear, he continued. The poison was not added during tea. That would have required haste, fear, risk. Poirot shook his head. No, the poison was added before the guests arrived. Geraldine inhaled sharply. Poirot raised one finger. The cup was prepared early, by someone with authority to do so without question. Poirot turned slightly. Lady Hawthorne. All eyes moved toward her. Lady Hawthorne's voice trembled. I've already admitted. Poirot raised a hand gently. Yes, madam, you prepared the cup. Poirot paused deliberately. But you did not conceive the plan. Poirot raised a second finger. The poison itself came from the conservatory, a rare plant, tasteless, fast-acting. Poirot's gaze shifted. Only one person here has both routine access to those specimens and the knowledge to advise their use. Poirot turned fully. Alistair Hawthorne. Alistair smiled faintly. Knowledge is not guilt. Poirot nodded. Correct, but guidance is. Poirot began pacing slowly. You suggested tea because it is predictable. You suggested dosage because you understood its effects. And you suggested that the hostess, not you, prepare the cup. Poirot stopped. Because in this house, he said softly, the hostess is trusted. Alistair crossed his arms. You're weaving speculation. Poirot smiled gently. Then allow me to remove doubt. Poirot gestured toward Thomas Wilkes, who stood nervously near the door. You were asked to bring a cup early, Poirot said. Thomas nodded. And you were told to forget. Thomas nodded again. Poirot turned back to the room. This crime did not rely on secrecy, Poirot said. It relied on obedience. Poirot raised a third finger. And finally, the motive. Poirot looked toward Philip Marrow. Mr. Whitcomb intended to revise estate documents, Poirot said calmly. Documents that would have stripped Alistair Hawthorne of control. Alistair's jaw tightened. Poirot continued. Edgar Whitcomb was not killed in anger. He was removed as an obstacle, Sir Reginald whispered. My God! Poirot turned slowly back toward Alistair. You never touched the cup, Poirot said. You never entered the drawing room at the crucial moment. You never raised suspicion. Poirot leaned slightly forward. You simply advised, reassured, directed. Alistair's smile faded. You believed, Poirot continued, that politeness would protect you. Silence pressed heavily against the velvet walls. Alistair finally spoke. You have no proof I intended his death. Poirot nodded calmly. Indeed, Poirot said. That is why this is not the end. Poirot straightened. Inspector Japp, Poirot said quietly. Please explain what was found this afternoon. Japp stepped forward. The conservatory cabinet was accessed again after the murder. One jar had been replaced. Alistair's eyes flickered. Poirot smiled faintly. Someone returned, Poirot said softly, to restore order. Poirot's gaze locked onto Alistair. And only one man here would feel the need to ensure nothing appeared disturbed. The room felt suddenly very small. Poirot took a slow breath. This evening, Poirot said, was not arranged to accuse. Poirot paused. It was arranged to observe. Poirot gestured subtly. And, monsieur, you have been observed? Alistair's composure cracked just slightly. Enough. Poirot turned toward the door. There will be one more gathering, Poirot said calmly. A final one. Japp frowned. Another? Poirot nodded. Yes, Poirot replied softly, because the truth is now visible, but not yet undeniable. Poirot looked back at Alistair Hawthorne one last time. And the most dangerous men, Poirot added, are those who still believe they are in control. As the guests were dismissed, the velvet drawing room felt heavier than ever before. The walls had listened, the room had remembered, and somewhere deep within Hawthorne Manor the killer realized something crucial. The polite game was over. Chapter 8. The trap set with courtesy Hawthorne Manor had grown restless. After the gathering in the velvet drawing room, no one returned to routine with ease. Doors closed more quietly than usual. Servants spoke only when necessary. Even the clock seemed hesitant, their ticking louder in the pauses between conversations. Hercule Poirot welcomed this unease. Discomfort, he believed, was truth's most loyal ally. He spent the morning not questioning anyone directly, but moving. From corridor to corridor, from conservatory to pantry, from study to servants' hall, always politely, always observant. To the casual eye, he appeared to be tying loose ends. In reality, he was tightening a net. Inspector Japp caught up with him near the library. You've rattled them, Japp said quietly. Especially Alistair, Poirot nodded. Good. A man who depends on order becomes careless when it is disturbed. Poirot paused outside the conservatory. Inspector, he said, today we allow the killer to believe he still controls the situation. Japp frowned. Isn't that dangerous? Poirot smiled faintly. Only for him. It's the manufactured opportunity. By midday, Poirot made a deliberate request. He asked that the conservatory cabinet be opened once more, in the presence of witnesses. Servants were instructed to watch, keys were produced, the jars were examined. Everything appeared in order, almost too much so. Poirot noted the way Alistair Hawthorne stood slightly apart from the group, his posture relaxed, his expression confident. He did not intervene, he did not protest, he simply observed, like a man inspecting work already completed. Poirot turned suddenly. Monsieur Hawthorne, Poirot said pleasantly, you have an excellent system. Alistair smiled. Years of practice, Poirot nodded. Systems fail only when people interfere. Alistair's smile tightened, but he said nothing. That afternoon, Poirot did something unexpected. He asked Lady Hawthorne to prepare tea, not to serve it, only to prepare it. The request was delivered politely, almost casually, yet its effect was immediate. Lady Hawthorne's hands trembled as she agreed. The drawing room was empty when she entered. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the velvet curtains and the polished side table where the cups had once waited. Poirot stood near the doorway. "Madam," he said gently, "prepare the cups, as you did that evening." She hesitated. "Why?" Poirot replied softly. "Because memory is most honest when the hands repeat what the mind wishes to forget." She obeyed. As she arranged the cups, Poirot watched carefully. She paused at one cup. Always the same one, the one nearest the window. Poirot said nothing. When she finished, Poirot thanked her and dismissed her gently. He then did something subtle. He did not remove the cups. He left them. The killer returns. That evening, Poirot ensured the Manor believed the investigation had stalled. He allowed Inspector Japp to be seen writing reports. He spoke openly of logistics, paperwork, and delays. He even hinted, carefully, that Lady Hawthorne's confession might yet be accepted if no further proof emerged. Alistair Hawthorne listened and believed. Just before dusk, Poirot positioned himself in the servants' corridor, pretending to review notes. Thomas Wilkes passed twice, nervous and pale. "Someone is going to the conservatory," Thomas whispered. Poirot nodded calmly. "Let him." Minutes later, Poirot followed, silently. He entered the conservatory just in time to see Alistair Hawthorne standing before the cabinet, jar in hand. His movements were precise, practiced, familiar. He did not startle when Poirot spoke. "You are checking," Poirot said softly, "that everything remains as you wish." Alistair replaced the jar carefully. "A man likes order," he said coolly. Poirot nodded. "Especially when disorder threatens." Alistair turned slowly. "You have no proof I killed Whitcomb." Poirot smiled faintly. "No, but I have proof you cannot stop intervening." Alistair's eyes hardened. "Intervening is what saved this house," Poirot replied calmly. "Intervening is what exposed you." Poirot gestured gently. "You returned to the cabinet," Poirot said. "You returned to the cups. You returned because you could not trust others to finish what you began." Silence stretched between them. Alistair spoke finally. "You are relying on psychology, not law." Poirot inclined his head. "Law follows psychology." Poirot turned and walked away, leaving Alistair alone with his thoughts and his fear. At the breaking point that night, Poirot called for one final private meeting. Lady Hawthorne arrived first, her composure shattered beyond repair. Tears clung to her lashes, exhaustion bent her posture. "I can't bear this anymore," she whispered. "He keeps telling me it will end." Poirot nodded gently. "It will, but not the way he promised." Moments later, Alistair entered. The three stood together in the velvet drawing room, the very place where Edgar Whitcomb had died. Poirot did not accuse. He simply spoke. "Edgar Whitcomb trusted order," Poirot said calmly. "He trusted expertise. He trusted that those who managed systems did so responsibly." Poirot turned toward Alistair. "You exploited that trust," Alistair laughed softly. "He was going to dismantle everything." Poirot nodded. "And you dismantled him," Lady Hawthorne gasped. Poirot raised a hand. "You told her," Poirot said, "that the poison would only delay him. That tea would be invisible. That responsibility would dissolve in politeness." Poirot stepped closer. "You never lied loudly," Poirot continued. "You reassured quietly." Alistair's voice rose for the first time. "Someone had to make the decision," Poirot replied softly. "No one had the right." Silence returned. Poirot turned to Lady Hawthorne. "You believed you were acting," Poirot said gently, "but you were being used." She broke down completely. Alistair stared at her, then away. Poirot observed the moment carefully. This was the crack. The net tightens. Poirot straightened. "Monsieur Hawthorne," he said calmly, "there will be a final gathering tomorrow morning." Alistair frowned. Another? Poirot nodded. Yes. Why? Poirot met his gaze. Because, Poirot said, you will attempt to correct one last thing. Alistair's face drained of color. Poirot continued quietly. And when you do, you will do it in front of witnesses. Poirot turned toward the door. Good night, he said politely. As Poirot left the drawing room, he felt certain of one thing. The killer was no longer confident, no longer controlled, no longer invisible. The velvet drawing room had hidden murder once. Tomorrow, it would expose the man who believed politeness was power. Chapter 9. The truth spoken without velvet mourning arrived at Hawthorne Manor without ceremony. There was no mist to soften the grounds, no dramatic hush in the corridors. Instead, the house felt stripped, exposed to daylight in a way it had not been since Edgar Whitcomb's death. Servants moved quietly, but without the reverence that once defined their steps. Something had shifted. Authority, once unquestioned, had begun to fracture. Hercule Poirot welcomed this clarity. The final gathering was arranged not in the evening, not under chandeliers and velvet, but in the late morning, when excuses tired easily and shadows had nowhere to hide. Once again, everyone assembled in the velvet drawing room, but this time it felt different. The chairs were no longer perfectly aligned, the side table stood bare, the teapot was absent. The room's elegance had been deliberately undone. Inspector Japp stood near the doorway, notebook in hand. Poirot took his place at the center. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot said calmly, thank you for coming one last time. Alistair Hawthorne leaned against the wall, arms folded, his expression controlled but tight. Lady. Hawthorne sat rigidly, eyes fixed on the floor. Sir Reginald stood behind her, pale and silent. Poirot did not begin with accusation, he began with sequence. Edgar Whitcomb, Poirot said, did not die because of a single action. Poirot paced slowly. He died because a system was manipulated. Poirot gestured gently toward Alistair. A system of hierarchy, a system of trust, a system where instruction is rarely questioned. Alistair smiled faintly. You keep speaking of systems. That proves nothing. Poirot nodded. Then let us speak of behavior. Poirot turned toward the window. Yesterday afternoon, Poirot said calmly, the conservatory cabinet was opened again. Alistair stiffened. Poirot continued. No instruction required, no justification offered. Poirot turned back. You returned because you believed something was unfinished. Alistair scoffed. That cabinet is under my care. Poirot nodded. Exactly. Poirot raised one finger. You advised Lady Hawthorne which plant to use. Alistair shook his head. She had access. Poirot raised a second finger. You advised the dosage. Alistair's jaw tightened. Poirot raised a third finger. You advised the timing. Poirot stopped pacing. And finally, Poirot said softly, you advised silence. The room felt suddenly airless. Lady Hawthorne looked up sharply. Poirot turned to her. Madame, he said gently, did Alistair ever promise that this would end cleanly? Her voice shook. Yes, Poirot nodded. And did he tell you, Poirot continued, that no one would suspect you? She whispered. Yes. Poirot turned back to Alistair. You offered peace, Poirot said calmly. But peace built on obedience always collapses. Alistair laughed sharply. You have no confession. Poirot inclined his head. Then allow me to supply the pressure. Poirot gestured toward Inspector Japp. Inspector, Poirot said quietly, please inform Monsieur Hawthorne of the findings delivered this morning. Japp stepped forward. The plant compound used in the poisoning, Japp said, was prepared in advance. The mixture shows evidence of refinement, adjustment beyond basic extraction. Alistair's eyes flickered. Japp continued. Someone with repeated handling experience. Poirot nodded. And finally, Poirot added, someone who returned to the cabinet to replace the jar. Alistair's composure cracked, just barely. Poirot stepped closer. You returned, Poirot said quietly, because you could not tolerate disorder. Alistair's voice rose. I was protecting the estate, Poirot replied softly. You were protecting control. Silence. Then, a sound not often heard in Hawthorne Manor. A chair scraped harshly against the floor. Alistair straightened, his calm shattered at last. "Yes," he snapped. "I told her what to use. I told her when. I told her how much." Lady Hawthorne gasped. "But I never expected him to die," Alistair continued. "He was meant to fall ill, to delay his revisions." Poirot's voice was calm. "Poison does not negotiate." Alistair laughed bitterly. "He was destroying everything. My position, my authority, the order of this house." Poirot met his gaze. "And so," Poirot said softly, "you destroyed him." Alistair's shoulders slumped. "I never touched the cup," he muttered. Poirot nodded. "No, you touched the people." Lady Hawthorne broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. "I trusted you," she cried. Alistair looked away. Poirot turned to Inspector Japp. "The confession is complete," Poirot said calmly. Japp nodded. "Alistair Hawthorne, you are under arrest for the murder of Edgar Whitcomb." Constable stepped forward. Alistair did not resist. As he was led away, he paused and looked once more at the velvet drawing room. "All that politeness," he murmured, "for nothing." Poirot replied quietly, "For truth." The room emptied slowly. Lady Hawthorne remained seated, hollow-eyed. Sir Reginald placed a hand on her shoulder, though he said nothing. Poirot lingered near the window, watching sunlight fall across the carpet, where porcelain had once shattered. The truth had been spoken, but truth, Poirot knew, did not end suffering. It only ended lies. As he turned to leave, Poirot paused. There was one thing left to do, to leave Hawthorne Manor not with scandal, but with understanding. Chapter 10. When velvet no longer hides the truth. Hawthorne Manor did not mourn loudly. There were no black banners hung from its gates, no solemn procession across the lawns. The house had been built for dignity, not grief, and dignity insisted on quiet. Yet in the days following Alistair Hawthorne's arrest, the manor felt stripped of something far more valuable than elegance. It had lost its certainty. Morning light entered the velvet drawing room without resistance now. The heavy curtains were drawn back each day, not out of ceremony, but necessity. Servants moved more freely, less carefully. Conversations, once filtered through politeness, were now hesitant but honest. Hercule Poirot noticed everything. He stood near the tall windows, hands clasped behind his back, observing the familiar room in its altered state. Without its shadows, the velvet appeared less rich, the chandeliers less forgiving. The room was no longer a stage. It was simply a room. Inspector Japp joined him quietly. "They've taken Alistair to London," Japp said. "Full confession recorded." Poirot nodded. "As it was always meant to be." Japp hesitated. "You think he regrets it?" Poirot considered this carefully. "He regrets losing control," Poirot replied softly. "Not the decision." They left the drawing room together and crossed into the morning room, where Lady Hawthorne sat alone with a cup of untouched tea. She looked up as Poirot entered. "I keep expecting him to walk in," she said quietly, "to tell me everything will be managed." Poirot inclined his head. "You lived inside a system, madame. Systems do not vanish easily." Her voice trembled. "I believed order meant safety." Poirot sat opposite her. "Order without conscience," Poirot said gently, "becomes cruelty." She closed her eyes. "I prepared the cup." Poirot nodded. "Yes." "I handed death to a man who trusted me." Poirot's voice remained calm. "You handed trust to someone who misused it." She looked up sharply. "That doesn't absolve me." Poirot shook his head. "No, but it explains you." He stood. "Guilt acknowledged," Poirot said softly, "is not the same as guilt concealed." She nodded slowly, as though committing the thought to memory. Outside, the grounds of Hawthorne Manor stretched quietly beneath pale skies. Workmen were already present near the conservatory, cataloguing plants, removing cabinets, dismantling the quiet authority that once ruled unseen. Poirot walked through the glass house one last time. Without Alistair Hawthorne, the conservatory felt strangely ordinary. The rare plants remained dangerous, but no longer deliberate. Poison, Poirot reflected, required intention far more than access. Sir Reginald Hawthorne waited near the path. "I failed," he said bluntly. "I trusted management over morality." Poirot regarded him kindly. You trusted familiarity, Poirot said. Many do. Sir Reginald exhaled. Whitcomb warned me. I didn't listen. Poirot nodded. Warnings often sound inconvenient. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the faint rustle of leaves. The estate will change, Sir Reginald said. Transparency, oversight. Poirot smiled faintly. Good. Sunlight improves even the most elegant houses. By afternoon, Poirot prepared to leave. His suitcase stood neatly packed in the front hall, exactly as it always did. Nothing extra, nothing forgotten. He paused once more at the threshold of the velvet drawing-room. This was the room that had hidden murder beneath manners. Now it held only memory. Poirot walked slowly to the spot where Edgar Whitcomb had collapsed. There was no mark left, no stain, no evidence. But Poirot knew better. Murder, he murmured, believes it can disappear. Inspector Japp waited by the door. Another case finished, Japp said. Poirot shook his head gently. None, Inspector. Another lesson completed. They stepped outside together. As the carriage arrived, Poirot turned for one final look at Hawthorne Manor. It stood as it always had, grand, composed, dignified. But now it was honest. Poirot climbed into the carriage and settled back as the driver took the reins. Japp lingered. You always leave quietly, Poirot smiled. Truth does not require applause, he said. The carriage rolled forward. Through the window, Poirot watched the manor recede, its velvet rooms replaced by open road and pale sky. Another house restored to itself, another lie corrected, another life understood too late, but understood nonetheless. Poirot closed his eyes. Poison, he reflected, is rarely the true weapon. The carriage moved steadily onward. The true weapon, Poirot whispered, is persuasion when wielded without conscience. And with that thought, Hawthorne Manor faded into distance, no longer a place of secrets, but a place that would remember shirts. End of story. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this mystery held your attention, share your thoughts below. Which character do you believe carried the greatest responsibility, and why? Your reflections and interpretations are always welcome. If you enjoy long-form Hercule Poirot mysteries, please like the video and subscribe for more timeless detective stories. Until our next case, remember, manners may hide guilt, but truth always speaks.